Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this author talk event with Dr. Joy Sanchez-Taylor, who is the author of Diverse Futures, Science Fiction and Authors of Color. My co-host is Jay Moses, who has the print copy and was holding it up. I've got the ebook copy, and I think the author who is joining us has the hardback copy. So we've got all three versions. There we go. Represented. It's fantastic to see such a large live audience. If you are joining us live, then please do type out your questions and your comments using the questions box, and I'll relay those to Dr. Sanchez-Taylor, who will be telling us all about her research and her new book. She is an associate professor of English at LaGuardia Community College in New York. Her research interest is science fiction and fantasy literature by authors of color, and she has articles published with the journal Science Fiction Studies, Extrapolation, and the Journal of the Fantastic and the Arts. Joy, thank you so much for visiting us today and giving us your time.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Let's start. First of all, Jay and I both really enjoyed this book. We got so much out of it, and I think it's a really important book for anyone interested in science fiction, so we heartily recommend it. And it is available at all good bookstores, published by Ohio State University Press. You can buy it in ebook form, which is what I did in the UK, but I could have also got the paperback. I just couldn't wait. But do check out the book. Just to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book and what led you to this area of research?
Goodness, not a traditional journey, which I don't necessarily recommend, but I also think is a really good lesson for people that you don't always have to take the traditional route, which I think is, great for your university, with, potentially non-traditional students. But I did write about science fiction and race for my dissertation. That was 8 years ago. And like all good dissertations, it was not the project I had envisioned, time constraints and committee constraints. And I ended up walking out with my PhD and going, never again. I'm not writing anything after this. I've been traumatized. I think I'm going to get a nice teaching job. And I was really fortunate to get hired at LaGuardia Community College, which is a very unusual community college. So especially for people who don't know US systems, in the US, a lot of the community colleges are very teaching heavy and they don't tend to value research as much. But LaGuardia is part of the City University of New York system. So they actually give release time in the first 5 years that you're hired there for tenure track faculty to do research. So when I got hired, they told me you will have to, you'll have to go to conferences, you'll have to do some research, you'll have to publish at least one journal article. And I said, oh, okay, I can do that. That's easy. And the more that I started going to conferences and doing research and rekindling, why did I love studying science fiction? It occurred to me, what I actually researched for my dissertation has value. It's important, and I feel like people need to know about it. So I actually spent years after that completely redoing it. So it is not my dissertation. I completely rewrote it. I rewrote it so that it would be the book that I had always envisioned, with multiple authors discussed per chapter, thematically rather than chronologically or historically. And I wanted it to be sort of a guidebook, an introduction to science fiction by authors of color that could be read by anyone. So I tried to write it as accessibly as possible and to center the chapters around, at least 3 of the 4 chapters are recognizable tropes of science fiction. And then in the 4th chapter, I wanted to take people into an area that is a little bit less known with Indigenous science.
So much at the beginning of your book, you kind of introduce it with a kind of an autobiographical story of kind of entering the genre, which has traditionally been white, or at least, that's part of the book's purpose. You mind sharing a little bit about your encounter with this white genre science fiction and how you negotiated that as Latina?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, growing up, you know, you're never explicitly told that sci-fi fantasy is a white genre. It's just sort of an assumed thing. When you go to the science fiction and fantasy aisle at a bookstore or a library, overwhelmingly the covers feature white characters, and so it just gets internalized. And like a lot of people of color who read science fiction, I just considered myself an oddity. I was a Latina nerd, you know, oh, I'm the only one. And then I talk about it in the introduction of Diverse Futures that right before I went into my PhD program, I read Junot Díaz's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. And that was the first time I saw a Latino nerd, you know, depicted in fiction. You know, another Latino who loved Tolkien and comic books and all of the great sci-fi things that I grew up with. And I, you know, at that point, that made me question, one, because I was like, why is this the first time I'm seeing this now that I think about it? And two, you know, Junot Díaz does a great job of referencing other science fiction authors of color, in particular, Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany. So that reference made me want to look into those authors. And then I started as a hobby, and then eventually one of my professors recommended, hey, what if you wrote about this for your dissertation? So yeah, it was a lot of work. It was a lot of word of mouth research because a lot of these authors are not as well known. But I found it, you know, really rewarding to go into these online communities of science fiction fans and be able to find people like me who really thought they were the only you know, nerd of color out there in the world, and now we're connecting. So I think it's great. And I grew up reading all of the traditional sci-fi fantasy works. You know, and I love them, and I still love them. But the work that I do now, the authors that I'm researching are writing things that I not only love reading, but I can really see myself represented in. So, and that's so important, especially for the next generation.
Yeah.
So do you feel that things have got better in that regard? I mean, the impression I get from your book is that there is hope, and the online communities in particular give people spaces and help promote voices and so on. But there is still more work to be done in terms of making sure there is equality in science fiction. And when we think about science fiction, we don't just think about, you know, the ABC, Asimov, Bradbury, Clarke, but we think of some other letters as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of hope, actually. And in the conclusion of Diverse Futures, I do a whole rundown of all the good things that are happening, in particular online, with science fiction and authors of color. So, you know, the internet has been a big boon. I say, you know, at the beginning of the conclusion of Diverse Futures, I couldn't have written this book without the internet. It would not have been possible. So there's a lot of great online communities that are connecting. So there's, God, I can't even name. It's in the conclusion of Diverse Futures, but I'll name out a few, you know, Black Girl Nerds, the Black Science Fiction Society. There's Imagining Indigenous Futurisms on Facebook. So there's a lot of really great science fiction and fantasy communities that are centered around specific races and ethnicities. Things like Kickstarter have made it possible for authors of color who want to write science fiction who can't get it published somewhere traditionally to get funding to create these projects. And I think a lot of the magazines. So I've seen, you know, there are new magazines like Fire magazine, but then also other magazines like Asimov's and Fantastica. You know, they're really branching out into special issues that are, you know, in particular for Black, Indigenous, people of color authors, LGBTQIA authors. So I'm seeing a lot of really exciting work being published in the magazines. I think the challenges, and there are publishers, small publishers, Rosarium Press, Mocha Memoirs Press that are doing some really great work lifting up Black, Indigenous, people of color voices in science fiction. So they're doing a lot of the legwork. And since I know you guys are also have a big focus on fantasy, Milton Davis and MV Media as well in fantasy. So a lot of that good work is happening. And there are a lot of really devoted people who are putting in a lot of unpaid labor to make that work happen. And I think that's the issue that I discuss in the conclusion, is that a lot of this is happening by word of mouth. It takes these authors a lot of unpaid labor to get the word out. The publishers, the authors, they're all putting in way too many hours. And it's a problem that could be easily fixed if we had more diversity in publishing. And so, I know that's an issue that's come up multiple times. There's whole social media, conversations around it. But the more diversity we get into big publishing houses that publish science fiction and fantasy, the more that we'll have breakout works like, Tony Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone being on the New York Times bestseller list for 52 weeks. There is an audience for this. These books can make a lot of money if they're recognized and if the people reading them understand what the authors are trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was listening to a civil rights leader here in Chicago talk about that the most revolutionary aid for people of color in a post-Floyd world is the cell phone, because you can film what's going on right then. And it kind of reminds me of what you're saying here, is that the internet is a way of getting word out when the major sources are blocked. It's a help and it's a hindrance, because we have things like Kickstarter. A lot of times these authors are encouraged to do platforms like that instead of reaching out to the publishing houses. And a Kickstarter takes a lot of time and a lot of unpaid labor. And I would rather these authors be published a little bit more traditionally, get some advances, be able to focus on their writing and not have to focus so much on advertising and getting the word out and doing the Kickstarters and all of that. Sure.
And there's steps forward and there's also, I suppose, steps sideways. I mean, I was really enjoying your analysis of the story of your life. Is that the name of the text in chapter 1?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, this is fascinating and it feels familiar. And then I realized, I've seen the film version, Arrival, but I had no idea it was based on a book, or that had this kind of this narrative that challenges Eurowestern viewpoint of time and the idea of progress. That didn't come out in the film for me, and maybe I was missing it. But it's a step forward in that, and you talk about that in the conclusion. Authors of color can get their work turned into films and so on, and through TV series and so on. But I don't know if it's really making the mainstream splash that it should, because I don't know how you felt about that adaptation, if you saw it, whether it missed the point of the story.
I'd say I enjoyed the adaptation, but yeah, a lot of times, in particular for more cerebral authors like Ted Chiang, who is a lovely human being and is so introspective, it's really hard to put that on the film screen. So I understand. I know that the person who adapted it for film was a huge fan of Ted Chiang. He was in contact with him. He got permission to adapt this. So I know that he valued the story and understood it. But there's a lot of internal dialogue that happens in the short story version, where the narrator is thinking to herself about her perceptions of language and how those perceptions of language and time and linear time in particular are being challenged. And the story itself in the story version is not told in a chronological order also. So I think a lot of that got lost in the film version. And then I think there's always a danger of, not so much in Arrival, because the characters' races aren't explicitly stated necessarily, but in a lot of works that I talk about in Diverse Futures, I think there would be a real danger if they got adapted of them being whitewashed. And we definitely don't want to see that happen. So, you know, these creators, they have to be careful that their work goes into the hands of people who will understand, you know, what their vision is and you know, what we're going to get to see matches. And then, yeah, there's just certain things that you can do so much better in writing that you can't necessarily do in a film version. But I do like the visual, you know, that I actually got to see the aliens visualized. I like the language, the way that they depicted it on the screen. You know, it's always nice when I imagine something in my head to then be able to see the actual visual. So I enjoyed that part of it. But yeah, I think a lot of the value of nonlinear time and the way that can help people perceive the world got lost a little bit in the film version.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's
like,
fascinating.
So go ahead, Jay.
That's just such a fascinating point you make there about time, because those who have any connections from the majority culture, the white culture, into indigenous communities know their sense of time is such a rich resource and reservoir. And yet, if we name the last, you know, if we picked up the anthology of time travel stories, the best ones, that you wouldn't have anything of that in there. So it's such a, things you don't see are just right underneath the surface and have always been there.
Yeah, and in a lot of indigenous cultures in particular, and I will tell your audience that I never want to, one of the dangers of writing a book like the one that I wrote is that I never want to make it seem like all of these cultures are doing the same thing, that they're all similar, that these authors are all similar. They're all doing their own thing, and there are many indigenous cultures that don't hold those viewpoints. But there are several across the globe, not just in one particular place. Indigenous cultures in Africa, indigenous cultures in the Americas that hold, you know, this non-linear view of time. They view time as cyclical. They view the cycle as ongoing. And so they pass down stories and information from generation to generation, holding that information so that they can look at the patterns. And indigenous cultures have been able to predict severe weather, everything from severe weather to, you know, many other different events that we are just now, you know, in Western science starting to value that level of information that they have gathered and call it science, because in a lot of ways, you know, Western culture looks at that and calls it storytelling or calls it religion. They don't necessarily call it science, but when you collect data over, you know, centuries and you hold it, whether you write it down or not, you know, that is scientific and that is a process, and it should definitely be valued. And a lot of that is showing up too in things like cutting edge theoretical physics. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the things that we consider cutting edge and new in Western science, for a lot of indigenous cultures, they've had this information for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was reminded last year I did a panel discussion for Pembroke College as part of the Talking Lecture series. And we had fantastic presenters or previous lectures, amazing authors. And I asked a question which was, will the pandemic change our view of the natural world? Because in the past, fantasy has all been about kind of natural landscapes as places of healing, whereas now it's don't go to the beach because you'll get COVID and die if you're around these places. So I wondered if that was going to sort of change that trope in fantasy. And one of the speakers, Rebecca F. Kwong, said, well, you know what? Authors of color have been talking about toxic landscapes for decades. And I wasn't, you know, because I was just thinking of Tolkien and so on. I mean, it is easy to forget all those other perspectives and not just sort of, oh, it's different, but actually read these texts and listen to these voices, because they're ahead of the rest of literature in some ways, or they're saying things that other, the world sort of catches up to. Did you find that when you were looking at these texts, that there is a kind of things that sort of are now being kind of caught up with in terms of the perspective, in terms of what they're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm still getting over being jealous that you had R.F. Kuang
Yeah,
on a
no, she's
panel,
amazing.
because I love her, and The Poppy Wars is an amazing
Yeah.
set of books. I will say that I think a lot of the issues that came up in the pandemic in terms of, you know, our rights, having our bodies restricted, having to deal with our actions impacting others in our communities. A lot of that, communities of color have been dealing with for a very long time. And so I think, nothing good has come out of the pandemic. I will never say anything good about the pandemic, but I will say that I think now people are more aware. The average person here in the US tends to be more aware of climate change and how that's impacting us, and more aware of how their actions actually connect to others. Because I think, as much as I say the internet is a good thing, it's also been hurting us in terms of connecting with other people. And so the idea that, we're being forced to reckon with how our actions are impacting the community, I think those are very good things. And I think those are things that are already in the works that I talk about in Diverse Futures. A lot of the authors, not just the Indigenous authors, there are a lot of African-American authors. I'm thinking of basically the entire chapter of my book on Indigenous and Western science. I have authors of multiple races and ethnicities in that chapter who write these wonderful works with, living ships that have a symbiotic relationship with the people on the ships, communities that are aware, of their interconnectivity, societies that are built on those ideas. And so, yes, I think that's already here. There is a whole section of science fiction cli-fi that is dealing with climate change and its impacts and everything. But I mean, I won't say because I haven't read all of it, but I will say that I miss in those works sometimes the idea of the interconnectivity of all beings on the planet. The idea that we're all going to have to recognize our impact on not only other people, but other species, on the actual planet itself, when we go to deal with these issues. So I think that's one of the things that the authors in this book, in particular in the Indigenous and Western Sciences chapter, I managed to find authors that are looking back at Indigenous knowledge in order to create these really amazing futures where, you can see that interconnectivity a lot better.
So go ahead, Jay.
No, I was just going to say I was really drawn to a phrase you mentioned in the book, that people of color need images of tomorrow, and our people need them the most. And it just made me think about how narrative can create the future, and how
I can't take credit. That's Samuel Delaney.
Well, you quoted it. It was wonderful. But there's such an ethical repercussion to what you're writing about what we're doing now. I don't know if you would just say a few words about kind of that subversive element within science fiction that can aid us for a better future, even when the genre itself is kind of contaminated in some ways.
Yeah, I say in the introduction that this is why these authors are drawn to this genre. This is literally the genre of literature where anything is supposed to be possible. So, of course, people who are being marginalized would look at this genre and go, oh, here's where I can write about, the hope. Here's where I can write about how this could change. And yes, there are some real barriers to them being able to do that, with the history of science fiction being very white and Eurocentric. But there is that possibility in there. And it's been there from the beginning. I mean, War of the Worlds. we've been able to use science fiction to critique things like colonization, and to show people, the alien point of view, which very often gets construed as the other, and the racial other in particular. So science fiction has so much potential, and that potential is going, it's my hope that that potential gets realized, and I see it happening, and the authors that I'm writing about for this book are making it happen. And it's very important, because one of the things, I see this impact all the time. I teach at one of the most diverse community colleges in the US. We're CUNY system is huge. LaGuardia has students from, almost every country on the globe. A lot of these students have immigrated to the US, or their parents have immigrated to the US, and they're looking for opportunity. They're looking to be able to express themselves. And so the one thing that I try to get them to see, when I tell them we're going to read science fiction, they look at me like, what? I don't read science fiction. And then I tell them, wait, it's not that sci-fi. Let's put it that way. And they're able to see in these stories that these authors are talking about issues of colonization and immigration and otherness and alienation. And they go, wait a minute, that's my story. So science fiction has so much potential and so much power to show people that there is a possibility for change. And we really do need that, because I see my students in particular all the time, it always makes me sad when I see them limit themselves. They're constantly telling me what they can't do, and what's not open to them, and that's true in a lot of ways. But I'm hoping for the future that they'll be able to see more opportunity for themselves. They'll be able to, if you can see yourself in the future, then you can actualize that, you can make it happen. But if you can't even, and an author like Tomi Adeyemi has talked about this in detail. She's so wise. She's in her 20s, and I swear she's so wise. And she talks about not even knowing how to start writing descriptions of Black people in her literature, because there literally are no descriptions for the hair types that she's talking about, for the some of the features that she's talking about. So these authors are literally building these worlds from the language they use up. And in doing so, they're going to inspire generations to come, who will actually be able to see themselves represented accurately in the future.
Is that particular to science fiction? What about fantasy? How does that work? Are you thinking about fantasy as well?
Yes, I am, and I'm thinking about it a lot more these days. I told you both, but I'll tell the audience that my next project, I'm hoping, if I am able to get the grant that I'm going for, is going to be fantasy based, because I cannot ignore what's happening. In young adult fantasy in particular, authors of color have managed to take off. I'm very excited about the work they did. I just finished a reading group for the Center for Fiction here in New York this summer called Rethinking Race in Fantasy Literature. And we talked about Tomi Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone, Niveau's The Empress of Salt and Fortune, and Darcy Littlebatter's Elatsoe. So 3 vastly different fantasy representations that are really sort of taking the traditional hero's journey, and in a lot of these works, turning it upside down. Just writing works that center women or center LGBTQIA peoples, writing works that are built on non-Eurowestern cultures, and a lot of these authors, in particular, like Tomi Adeyemi, Darcy Littlebadger, they're in their 20s. They're just starting out in their writing careers, and they already have so much awareness of what they're doing, and they've put so much time and work into the research, into the descriptions in their worlds, that I'm really excited to see what's happening there. And the fact that these works are getting public attention, that makes me very excited as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of good things happening in fantasy. The fact that, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's The Dark Fantastic won, was award winning. So yeah, and I'm so jealous of her cover too, because like, oh my God, I love Paul Lewin. So, I think it's works like that and the work that we're going to do in the next couple of years in fantasy studies, if these scholars can get support, if the authors and the scholars can both get support from traditional fantasy, structures, I think we can see some really exciting work happening in deconstructing the way that these authors use narrative structures that are not the traditional hero's journey, how they're using narrative structures from other cultures, the societies that these worlds are built on, for Children of Blood and Bone, Orisha culture is taking off in a lot of fantasy works. So I think these are really exciting things happening, and I want to see them keep happening. So I'm hoping my next project can raise some awareness about that. Originally, I had thought about writing diverse futures and including, at least one fantasy chapter. And once I got into it, I found if you don't focus, you're really going to get lost. So I ended up deciding to put that aside for the next project. But I am really excited because a lot of the authors that I write about intersect sci-fi and fantasy. So you can see some of the same names. If I were to write diverse fantasies and I were to write it exactly the way I wanted to, there would be a lot of authors from diverse futures who would also show up in diverse fantasies. Because the way that they're writing science fiction and incorporating cultural elements also leans them towards fantasy sometimes. And I think there's a lot of genre blurring going on, which I'm finding really exciting. I don't know, I know that there are some science fiction and fantasy scholars who don't like that, because as scholars, we do like to classify things. But I'm always excited when I see an author, Darcy Little Badger in Elatsoe, she's writing a book that has fairies, vampires, and ghosts in an indigenous-based culture. And I'm like, why did no one else think to do that? This is amazing, So I think we're going to see a lot of genre blurring, and I'm ready for fairies in space. Come on, let's go.
Definitely.
Joy, you mentioned in your book 4 or 5 communities: Latina, African American, Indigenous, and Asian. And I was kind of wondering if there was any other authors of color you would have wanted to put in there that you just didn't have the space for. Or you've even mentioned the LGBTQIA community a few times. How you see that intersecting in this, if at all, or if that, obviously that broadens it so much, but how you think about that?
Yeah, I think there are some important overlap between, studies of race in science fiction and studies of gender, obviously. A lot of these authors are intersectional that I'm writing about. River Solomon, self-identifies as LGBTQIA, Gabby Rivera. So several of the authors in here identify as LGBTQIA. And I thought it was really important when I was writing about their works in diverse futures to not only make that clear, but to really talk about how that impacts the way that they write about race. Because this book is centered on authors of color and how they're responding to sort of, a white Eurocentric viewpoint, it is mostly race, I'm addressing race, but there are areas in particular in the post-apocalyptic chapter where I'm also addressing authors like Sabrina Vourvoulias and Gabby Rivera. You can't talk about their dystopic future worlds without talking about the roles of women in those worlds, the roles of LGBTQIA people in those worlds. It's all interconnected. And so, yes, I encourage scholars of, science fiction and fantasy, when you are writing about an author who is an author of color and a member of the LGBTQIA community, that needs to show up in your analysis of those authors. That's part of their identity. And if you take it out of the equation, you're missing part of what you could be learning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just to respond to the what you were saying about fantasy, authors can employ the kind of what if for fantasy as well. So Marlon James watched the trailer for The Hobbit and said to his friend, "Where are the black people? Why aren't there any black people in Middle Earth?" And his friend said, "Well, you know, it's Eurowestern and, you know, based on British folklore and so on." So James said, "Okay, I'll create my own version. I'll create, you know, my own world." So that kind of thing is possible in fantasy, but in a different way. So looking forward to the new book when you write it. I hope you get the grant, because that sounds like a really important piece of work as well. The other thing I wanted to talk about was just kind of the way this book is structured. So we've talked a bit about the Indigenous science and Western science advanced technologies chapter. There's also a chapter on post-apocalyptic landscapes, a chapter on first contact narratives, and a chapter all about genetic modification. How did you end up with those 4 areas, and did they come out of the text, or did the areas come first and then you looked at texts, or was it kind of chicken and egg situation there?
Yeah, it was a little bit. I, you know, obviously had a list of texts in my head that I wanted to write about. The choosing of text, there were 2 important things for me. One is that the depictions of race and culture in the text went beyond surface description and really integrated, you know, cultural elements of, you know, because in a lot of science fiction, especially contemporary sci-fi, you can have diverse characterization, but are you learning about that character's culture? Are you going to their home? Are you encountering other languages? You know, not always. So I didn't want to include sci-fi that just had this sort of post-racial, diverse future. I wanted to include works where the ethnicities and cultures of the works were actually really well integrated. So that, you know, that was gatekeeping some works at the beginning. And then as I figured out which works I wanted to talk about, then I started grouping them. And a lot of authors like Octavia Butler could have been in every chapter. You know, Fledgling is my favorite work of hers, and it's the one that I've done the most research on. I actually went to the Octavia Butler archive over in California to do research on that text in particular. But, you know, it could have been in so many different chapters of this work. And so I also decided that every author was going to appear one time, and that they were only going to appear in one chapter. So I had to figure out, with a lot of these with a lot of these texts that are genre blurring and incorporating multiple sci-fi tropes, which chapter and was I going to discuss that in? So that helped me sort of group the works. And then I decided, in particular, I was beating myself up for not including an AI chapter, because I was like, oh, that would be so great. But in terms of word constraints and what the publisher wanted, I would have had to kick one of the other chapters out to do that. And I wasn't willing to do that, because I think that the chapters that I ended up with are the areas that people most need to know about. There's been a lot of work done with AI and cyberpunk literature, and authors of color have shown up in those works. So I decided to leave that out. It broke my heart, but I decided to leave out AI and in favor of talking about genetic modification, because if in a book that talks about race and science fiction, how can I not talk about, genetics? That was one of my favorite chapters to write, and the Indigenous culture chapter in particular were some of my favorites. And then I wanted to make sure that the majority of the chapters were recognizable sci-fi tropes, because I want this to be picked up by sci-fi fans. Yeah, and when I was writing the introduction and deciding what do I think is the definition of science fiction, because there's so many, I decided that the definition of science fiction for me is more fan-based. What do the fans think are science fiction? And the fans expect recognizable tropes. And that's when I got the idea, okay, what if I center the chapters on the tropes rather than trying to write this, chronologically, or trying to group them, by the year they were published or some other, and I definitely didn't want to group them by race and ethnicity, because there's too much of that going on already. I wanted every chapter to have authors who were different races and ethnicities, because I think it's important to talk about the places where these authors' ideas intersect. So all of that guided the way that I was thinking about. I don't think I was always consciously. I don't know how much of it was, super conscious and how much of it was just me going, okay, I need to organize. I need to find a way to organize this. But I'm happy with how it turned out, because I think if you're a scholar of sci-fi, you'll understand what I'm saying. But if you're a fan, if you don't do science fiction scholarship and you love science fiction and you watch it and you read it, I think you'll look at the chapter titles and go, oh, okay, I reckon, aliens. Okay, I can read a chapter on aliens. So that's what I'm hoping. And for fans, for students, I want this to be accessible. For sci-fi scholars, I wanted them to be able to learn something.
Yeah, and you've definitely succeeded. I mean, I think you talk in the conclusion about one of the challenges for authors of color is that kind of pigeonholing of like, oh, well, you only read this author if you're interested in reading an author of color kind of thing, as if that term is one group of people. Obviously it's not, and you talk about the limitations of that term as well, and why you use it. But likewise, this book, nobody should think this is the book to read if you're interested in authors of color in science fiction. This is the book to read if you're interested in science fiction, because it's just a great science fiction academic book that focuses on authors of color, which is a really, really important area of scholarship. Yeah, I think that definitely works. We've got a comment from someone in the audience, Brenton Dickinson, and this is a reminder for everyone to type in your comments and your questions. We've got about 20 minutes before we have to leave, so it'd be great to hear from all of you in the audience based on your thoughts on what everything that Dr. Sanchez-Taylor has been telling us. And Brenton writes in to say, thank you so much for the brilliant discussion and your absolutely essential resource. For a few years, I have been reading Black women science fiction writers such as Octavia Butler, Nala Hopkinson, Nnedi Okorafor, yeah, N.K. Jemisin, and others. It strikes me that these authors consistently transgress the limits of science fiction as a genre, adding elements of magic, the supernatural, and fantasy. Is there something about these writers that causes them to push past the edge? I would love to hear your thoughts.
I think, a lot of the authors that I write about in this book could be described as irreverent, which I love. I think is fantastic. And I think if you're really interested in the viewpoint of why, I would read N.K. Jemisin's acceptance speech, her Hugo acceptance speech. I think it speaks to a lot of why, and in particular, Black women sci-fi authors are transgressing these boundaries that we've set for science fiction. And in her acceptance speech, she talks about raising a rocket-shaped middle finger to the science fiction community. I'm not going to speak for every author in this book, but in terms of myself, I love science fiction. I love reading science fiction. That's why I wrote about science fiction. But yes, we're also at the same time aware that a lot of science fiction is not written for us or intended for us or addressing us at all. And so I think there are times, in the Broken Earth trilogy, N.K. Jemisin specifically, like around the middle of the second book, names the ability of the orogenes in her novel as magic. And when I read that, I knew exactly why she's using this loaded term in a work that was classified as science fiction and won the Hugo Award for each book. Again, it's that irreverence. It's that, guess what? This is a science fiction world, and we can have magic in this world too. You know, this is a science fiction world, but it looks mostly like the real world, you know, which sometimes gets categorized into magical realism. And so it's hard, because as much as I want to see authors do that, I enjoy that. That's the kind of reading that I really like to do. I think sometimes it also hurts these authors. Tananaritive Dew has talked in length. Kenitra Brooks, who is one of the editors for the New Sun series, who approved my book, talks about this in particular. For Black women authors in particular, crossing genres, writing sci-fi with horror elements or fantasy with sci-fi elements, can really hurt them in terms of publication, because the publishing houses don't know what to do with this. So I see a lot of genre blurring, and then I see a lot of authors that get relegated into, oh, this is magical realism. Even if it's hard science fiction, if it's a Latino author, sometimes, oh, this is magical realism. Oh, this is Afrofuturism. And then I talk about it in the introduction. I specifically use science fiction for the title of this book and throughout this book, because these are science fiction authors, as you said, and they deserve to be on the science fiction lists and in the science fiction aisle of the bookstore. And that's my vision for the future, is when we get out of this pandemic and I can go to a bookstore on a regular basis again, I want to walk into the science fiction section and see Nnedi Okorafor and N.K. Jemisin and Octavia Butler and all the other beautifully diverse covers that have come out that often are on online reading lists, but are not physically in the bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I think they're doing it on purpose, and I think they're challenging, you know, the limits of these genres, because for a lot of reasons, but one reason in particular being because they don't feel like they have to adhere to the genre. I think authors who don't feel like they're often included wouldn't necessarily feel like they have to adhere to genre conventions. And then some of it is cultural as well, because Indigenous culture considers a lot of what we consider magic or religion to them is science. So, you know, it's different forms of science sometimes coming up. And I'm forgetting, but Grace Dillon does a great article where she talks about conjure science. And if people are interested in that idea, they should look that up. Walking the Clouds, Grace Dillon, and then she has an article specifically on conjure science and the work of Andrea Hairston that really talks about the way that we see science and how we often take Indigenous science and label it as magic.
Brilliant. Jay, do you have another question?
No, just to your point about genre and publishing, you want to say something about the New Sun series so people can understand at least what's being published there?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm really excited. I was very lucky that the New Sun series had been started when I was shopping diverse futures to different publishers. I immediately saw that Ohio State was doing a series devoted specifically to alternate views of science fiction and speculative fiction. So looking at race and gender and sexuality in these genres. And I said, oh my God, this is exactly right for diverse futures. So I pitched the book there, and they were such a big help with helping me get through the process to actually get the book published. So really shout out to them. But if you go to the Ohio State University Press New Suns, it's called New Sun series. There's an entire series of books that have come out on speculative fiction and science fiction related to race, gender, and sexuality that are doing some amazing work. There's even horror. So they're really, you know, taking speculative broadly. There's been multiple works on Afrofuturism that have come out that way. And I'm not going to remember all the books of the series off the top of my head, but they're doing some really great cutting edge work. They published Afrofuturism Rising, which is Isaiah Levander III is a mentor of mine, and you know, he does great work in the field of Afrofuturism. So, and they're looking for more books if people have ideas to pitch that would fit into the series. And every book in the series gets a beautiful custom cover from the art duo Black Kirby, John Jennings and Stacey Robinson, who are really well-known graphic novel artists. So that's where I got lucky in that my cover is awesome, and that was not me, that was them.
Jay, can you hold up the cover again?
Right, yes, in color.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's so cool.
I was so honored that they would do the cover for me.
Fantastic. We've got another question from the audience. Avery writes in to say, Joy, such a wonderful talk as always. A question less about scholarship and more about personal tastes. What are some of your favorite science fiction texts? Can be literature, film, or anything. Were there any new discoveries you made during your research that you fell in love with?
Oh, goodness. All of them. How can I choose? I mean, of course, N.K. Jemisin and her Broken Earth series. I mean, Octavia Butler was the first author that really guided, whose work I found that I wanted to keep reading, and that it also made me desperately uncomfortable. And I think a lot of the authors in Diverse Futures do this really well. I think if a text is making you feel that uncomfortable, it's doing something right. And I mean, Octavia Butler is just one of those authors who has no parallel. She has not been matched yet. And when people would ask me, when I was doing my research on her and I would do presentations, they would ask me, who's the next Octavia Butler, or who should we read, that's like Octavia Butler. I said, well, she has no parallel, but N.K. Jemisin reminds me of her. And the Broken Earth trilogy, is brilliant. And I had the good fortune to be able to interview her, Sabrina Vourvoulias, and Eugene Lim for the Queen's Museum a couple of years back. And their works have so influenced me, so influenced the way that I think about science fiction. Reading Walking the Clouds by Grace Dillon, which was the first Indigenous science fiction anthology. I have it in my back shelf here. The book is like this big. And it's the word on Indigenous science fiction. I mean, it has not been matched yet. It's been out for years now, and nobody has come close to being able to describe Indigenous science fiction the way that Grace Dillon did. The introduction to that book is essential reading if you're interested in science fiction. So all of those really shaped the way that I think, the writing that I did for this book and the way that I think about it. River Solomon is the author that surprised me the most. An Unkindness of Ghosts broke my heart so many times, but it was so brilliantly written, that you don't mind. Mm-hmm. And so there's just so many, and lately I've been looking ahead, reading things that have just come out. Shelley Parker Chan's She Who Became the Sun, and Nhi Vo's The Empress of Salt and Fortune. If you have not read those and you're a fantasy lover, you have to. Again, they're just pushing the boundaries of fantasy literature, and they're, on top of it, they're just brilliant thinkers and brilliant speakers. I've gone to interviews of theirs, and I just love when the author turns out to be as awesome and thoughtful as I hoped they would. And that's one of my regrets. Somebody asked me, were there texts that I had to leave out that I regret? The fact that I couldn't span the entire globe. There's so many great authors doing work in the UK and Australia that I would have loved to have included, but I had to keep a focus. I had to stop somewhere. So I'm hoping somebody will take that on.
Yeah, I mean, like all good academic books, this grows my to-be-read pile massively. Right. So thank you for that. And you do say in the book, I hope this project is the start of a larger conversation about how science fiction, how the science fiction genre can work to be more inclusive of authors of color and the non-Eurocentric futures these authors imagine. So, there is more work to be done, as you say. And we've got a response from Brenton. He says, I agree about Octavia Butler as a master and maybe N.K. Jemisin as a huge contemporary figure. It might be worth noting that Jens Heber did his Signum master's thesis on Octavia Butler and symbiosis and ends up being one of only a few Butler theses. We need more scholars in this area. Yes, we do. Absolutely. And we need to promote that work. Yeah.
Yeah, I need to go look that up now. That was my work. When I went to the archive, I ended up writing an article called Fledgling Symbiosis and the Nature-Culture Divide.
Fantastic. Well, the thesis theatre has only just come out, so it's in our Signum library. So if you look on our website and go to the library, if you can't find it, Chris Swank will point to the way. Chris says, I'll send it to you, Joy. It's also on YouTube. Yeah.
Sounds like brilliant work.
So we are coming towards the end. Jay, I know you've got some more questions. Do you have any questions that you want to leave with? Any kind of, sorry to put all the pressure on you to think of.
No. What comes to mind is there's a show on CNN Sunday nights on sitcoms. It talks about humor, and one of the sections is on race and class and gender, and they talk about how humor is subversive. It allows us to talk about things in a way that we're not brave enough to do so normally. And your work here reminds me of the way that science fiction functions in the similar way of asking really important questions for the future and well-being of all of us, but especially those who haven't been seen, as a significant way to communicate that. So I'm just real grateful. I don't know about both of you, but I feel like I need to rewatch this and just write down all the titles of different things that have happened that you've mentioned. I just grateful for your work and look forward to the work that you're going to, I believe, God willing, be working on. So.
Thank you. That means so much to me. I really tried.
Yeah.
And you guys are my beta readers. The book just came out less than a month ago, so I haven't gotten as many reactions yet. So that's my big hope. I hope that people will read about these works and then go find them, because these authors are amazing, and some of them are not getting nearly the amount of recognition that they should be.
Well, let's change that. And your work helps change that, I think, as well. But it's also kind of up to kind of the community at large to seek out authors, to encourage publishers to be more diverse, to support authors and publishers who are doing these things. I think you give so much great advice in the conclusion about all these different groups we can join on Reddit and YouTube and Facebook and so on. So as you say, there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of inspirational change happening, and we need to all support it and promote it.
Please buy the books, follow the authors on social media, and request them from your local bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
If customers request these authors, the bookstores will carry them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez-Taylor. We've only scratched the surface with this book, but we've talked about some of the things that you raise. And for everyone else, if you haven't done so already, do check out Diverse Futures, Science Fiction and Authors of Color. It's available now from Ohio State University Press. And do join this conversation that the book is part of. Anything else to add?
Thank you. Thank you to everybody that I recognize from the audience panelists. I know Avery, thank you for asking a question. I know who that is. And I think my dad is here and it's his birthday. So happy birthday, Dad. And thank you for always supporting my dream my crazy dream to study science fiction as a PhD student.
Brilliant. Chris says, Joy, it's wonderful to see you again. Thanks so much for this talk and the book. And L'Oreal says, thank you so much, Joy and Gabriel and Jay. Ordering Diverse Futures right now. Excellent. And Susan says public libraries too. Especially if you can't afford to buy all the books, because I know what that's like. But use public libraries. At least in the UK, authors do get some money from the public libraries, but also it encourages, more awareness. You get things on bookshelves, so that's also good. And talking about the books as well is a big thing. Yeah. So, anything else to add, Joy?
Thank you guys so much for having me. Thank you for everybody in the audience who attended. It means a lot to me. This is my passion project. It's what I'm invested in. And I am always here and available if people have questions, if people are studying this and need support. I want to be there for everybody else who wants to amplify these authors and science fiction authors of color. So thank you all.
Fantastic. Well, what a wonderful place to end. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you for attending, and thank you for Dr. Joy Sanchez-Taylor for taking her time to be with us today. Until next time, happy reading. Good luck with everything, and we'll see you at the next Signum University event. Bye-bye.